Welcome back. It's No Apologies on Beck. We are now very happy to present our next guest who has been on with us before and entertained and enlightened us. It is Dr. Murray Sabrin. He is the founder of the Sabrin Center for Free Enterprise, Emeritus Professor of Finance. Dr. Sabrin, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Rick and Laurie. It's great to be back with you in this new year, and hopefully we'll have some new ideas and better policies coming out of Washington, D.C., but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, the thing I think I'm looking forward to most, Dr. Sabrin, is this year, I'm expecting a lot of inflation. You can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. And I've read articles that indicate that should be a good thing for me because I'm likely going to make more money. So I'm pretty excited about making more money this year. So if you don't mind, let's hop right into the topic of inflation, which I think is probably going to be one of the biggest topics over the next year, frankly. So give us your take on what's happening, why it's happening.
It's amazing to me that Federal Reserve officials and other economists are surprised inflation has been heating up for the past 12 months. When the Federal Reserve created $4 trillion in 2020 in order to boost the economy during the lockdowns, anyone who understands economics, understands money and credit, when you create that much money in a short period of time, that money spreads through the economy and eventually raises prices. And that's exactly what we're seeing in 2021 and 2022. And the question that I have, and we don't know the answer to this, but it's impossible to predict that far out. The last time we had a major inflation cycle, it lasted for nearly 16 years, from 1965 to 1981-82, where inflation accelerated during the Johnson administration, continued into the Nixon administration, and then decelerated, then reaccelerated in the 70s when we had the two oil shocks, and then reached the peak under the Reagan administration in the early 80s. And then we've been on a 40-year decline in the rate of inflation, where prices have been going up at a much slower rate than they were in the 70s and 80s, or early 80s. So inflation is clearly the result of money printing by central bankers who have a monopoly on creating money. And this is going back for the past several hundred years of central banking around the world and in the United States since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. So this is no surprise to me. I wrote a book 2.5 years ago on the Federal Reserve with the provocative title, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. And it still sucks because it creates these bubbles. It reduces people's purchasing power. It gives us unsustainable booms and then painful busts. And what it does primarily from a sociological economic point of view, it really enriches the top 1% in the economy. And they're doing quite well because they own a lot of assets, real estate and stocks, and those increase in value tremendously during these boom cycles. And so they're doing extremely well while the average worker, average family is losing purchasing power. But here's the real sad situation that we're in, Rick and Laurie. The rate of inflation for the past 12 months has been 7%. And what are we getting on our savings accounts and money market accounts? Close to zero. So we have just lost 7% of purchasing power on the savings that we have put away for that proverbial rainy day or to grow as we get older. And so this is, I think, one of the great tragedies we're facing in the American economy, where the Federal Reserve is really annihilating the finances of the average family, and no one is speaking up in the mainstream media or the AARP, because they're supposed to protect their senior citizen members, of the sheer lunacy that's going on in Washington, D.C., of printing money, hoping that this is going to create a good outcome, when all it does is debase the currency, which means price inflation, and distorting the economy, which means that the boom will turn into bust somewhere down the line.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very well said. One of the ways I look at it with this and how it hurts the various segments of the population, if you've got $1,000 sitting in a checking account at the beginning of 2021, effectively, the value of that $1,000 is now $930. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the past, without inflation, if you have a decent interest rate, at least it may maintain $1,000 of value, maybe slightly more. Whereas if you're a big-time property owner and you've got $1,000, say, worth of property, that's now still at least worth $1,000, possibly worth $2,000. And so it is yet once again another example where government is the reason for an increasing disparity between the high income and low income earners, or in other words, responsible for a great portion of income inequality.
There's no question about it. And the amazing thing for me is the people on the left who scream bloody murder about income inequality. Here is the prime example of the greatest income inequality generator that we have in human history, and they're silent. There's no one criticizing the Fed in Washington, D.C., except maybe a few voices in the House and maybe in the Senate. But the mainstream media are totally quiet. In fact, people are saying that inflation is good for you. Well, it's good for people who, as you pointed out, Rick, have property and their property values go up because mortgage rates are depressed. And so people rush into real assets, which is real estate, stocks, which are claims on real assets, the assets of corporations, collectibles. We've seen the price of some of these collectible items, paintings and other things, go through the roof at auctions. Automobile, I look one Saturday, I was watching one of these auction shows on television, and prices of these cars are just through the roof. Several $100,000s for restored cars, vintage cars from the 50s and 60s. And this shows you how much money is in the system where people feel they're confident to spend money that they otherwise probably would not spend on things that you would think would cost a little, but now they're priced at astronomical levels. And where I am in Southwest Florida, housing prices in some communities are up 40% from a year ago, which is really astonishing when you think about it, because that's an example of what people have called the everything bubble. Everything is being inflated: food prices, services, housing, you name it, it's going up, and the average worker is getting left behind.
I went and I took a look at a couple of different, actually 3 different headlines that I saw today. 7th straight month of inflation was one. Another one was on Twitter, and there was a hashtag that was trending that I watched trend called hashtag Bare Shelves Biden. And it trended in 6th place of all of Twitter, and everybody from across the country was putting their pictures of all the bare shelves all across the country. And then just today, Breitbart, you were talking about the cars. Breitbart had an article by John Carney from yesterday, actually, that was titled Bidenflation, New Car Prices Up 12%, New Trucks Up 11.6%, Used Cars Up 37.3%.
Yeah, this is why inflation is probably a lot higher than the consumer price index, which was released today, is indicating. There are some people who think the rate of inflation is probably double what it is today, and maybe even higher. Because if you buy basic commodity items in the supermarket, they're up 5, 10%, 15%, 20%. And the way they sneakily raise prices is they reduce the size of the container. And so therefore, the price may go up 5%, but the container's been reduced 5% in size. So you really got a 10% inflation instead of a 5% inflation.
So I've got a question for you. There's so much to cover. We could have you on for 24 hours straight. One of your, I believe you are predicting a recession of some sort coming up in the future. If you can explain to our viewers, why are you predicting the recession? What does it have to do with inflation?
Okay. What has happened historically in the United States is when inflation accelerates. In other words, we have an overheated economy. Prices are rising rapidly. Companies are falling over themselves to hire workers. They're raising wages, which is, of course, a good thing. But this is unsustainable because of all the, quote, easy money, the cheap money that the Federal Reserve has shoveled out the front door, so to speak, in order to stimulate the economy, which is their first error. The economy doesn't need stimulation. What it needs is freedom. It needs free enterprise. It needs laissez-faire. It doesn't need the heavy hand of government guiding the economy. It's never worked in the past. It never works now, and never will work in the future. So when the Federal Reserve begins this cycle of cheap money, which it did in 2008, 2009 to get us out of the Great Recession from the housing bust, that money has been going into the system and creating this huge, huge boom that's lasted now for 10 years, more than 10 years, except for the brief period where we had the economic downturn, the implosion because of the lockdowns in early 2020. And then the Federal Reserve created more money in order to boost us out of the lockdowns. So we have all this money sloshing around the economy. Wages are going up, prices are accelerating, asset prices are going through the roof. The Fed has already announced it's going to raise interest rates in order to slow down the growth of the money supply and stop the inflation that's in it, that's on the way right now. So when that happens, the key indicator to look at, and everyone on Wall Street is looking at this, is the yield curve. In other words, what are the interest rates between short-term rates and long-term rates? And historically, which I have in my book, when the short-term rates go above long-term rates, that's called the inverted yield curve. That means the Fed has really tightened up, that there's a scramble for liquidity, and some companies will not be able to survive the higher interest rates. And so they start laying off people, or they may have to merge, or they have to liquidate. But it becomes very difficult for some companies to stay afloat as interest rates are rising. Now, given the historical relationship between higher interest rates or the inverted yield curve and a recession, it's typically about a year out. So right now, the yield curve is not inverted. If it inverts sometime in 2022, we can expect a recession probably in 2023. If the yield curve doesn't invert in 2022, but inverts in 2023, then there's, I think, a 100% guarantee we'll have a recession in 2024, which is a presidential election year. And we know historically when there's a recession in an election year, the incumbent party loses big time in the polls that November.
Interesting. Looks like it's time for me to put more money into predict it for the 2024
like,
election.
How can I use this information? I love that. You do that every time.
I know.
That's great.
So this is something that I agree with you. I think a recession of some sort is coming. And what are you telling people? I mean, I'm not sure how a person can truly prepare for it unless you've got big liquidity, big cash, and then Dr. Sabrin, you'd say, hey, you should go buy a building or buy some farmland or something like that. But for us regular, average people that have, okay, maybe I've got a couple $1,000 or something, or maybe I'm just paying my bills every month. How in the world do you anticipate and protect yourself with an oncoming recession sometime in the next, we'll say, 48 months.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's going to happen. It's just inevitable. Let me put it that way. That's something I can guarantee we're going to have. Not only are death and taxes inevitable, so are recessions when you have easy money policies for so many years. So again, we're talking about business and the consumer. What should families do as we get closer and closer to a recession? Well, one thing you got to really worry about is, are you going to get laid off? Which I did exactly 40 years ago during the 81-82 recession, which was a very painful time for me and my wife when we were living in Massachusetts. And we had to come back to New Jersey in order to pick up the pieces, so to speak, because there was no job opportunities in Western Mass where we were living. So you've got to have cash reserves, because when you have a recession and you get laid off and you don't have enough cash reserves, even though you may be getting unemployment, your standard of living goes down quite a bit, which I can attest to personally from the experience 40 years ago. So you really should be building up your cash reserves during the good times and socking away enough money for 6 months or a year of living expenses, because you don't know if you do get laid off when that next job opportunity will come about. The next thing I think you should consider is, if you're an employee of any size company, is try to make yourself as indispensable as possible. And that means not only having the skills that you need for the job, but maybe skills that you could use in another job in that company. So you become sort of the
everyman.
The utility person, so to speak, where you become like a utility infielder in baseball. You can play second base, shortstop, and third base, and you make yourself valuable to the employer. That's really the key, I think, in a company where you show your value to the employer, who then would make it very difficult to let you off, because you are so productive, you are so knowledgeable about the company, about the customers, whatever the production process, whatever the case may be. So as I used to tell my students, there's no such thing as too much knowledge about anything, especially in an economy which is volatile. We know that. But the good news is that these long booms last now about 10 years, and recessions tend to last between 12 and 18 months. So again, raise cash, especially small businesses, because if they don't have enough working capital during a downturn, they may have to close their doors. So small business owners should be raising cash during the boom times, putting that aside, so when things get really dicey for them, they can weather the storm, so to speak, by not laying off key personnel and maybe laying off some workers that are not that critical for their business during a downturn. And the other thing that small business owners can do start to develop relationships, if they haven't already done so, with other businesses in the area and in the supply chain. So when things get soft in the economy, they still can get products that they need, inputs for their company at maybe better terms than they otherwise would get if they didn't have a good relationship with their suppliers. So there are a lot of things I talk about in my book in chapter 8 on small business, that what they could be doing to navigate the boom bust cycle. And I think this is the most valuable thing I could do for business people, is to show them when a recession probably will occur and what are their options, what are their alternatives when the recession hits, and what things they should be doing as we get closer and closer to the recession, which is by monitoring the yield curve.
Excellent, excellent advice for small business people and employers and employees. That's just so good, valuable.
Yeah, I like that. There's no magic bullets there. It's common sense, but it's really good to hear. It's interestingly, I think that the whole idea about saving, part of what spurs inflation further is people's behavior, right? When they're anticipating continued inflation, right, they don't save, they spend. Which makes it worse. So not only do you protect yourself, but if it's done en masse, you actually help stave off maybe a portion of that inflationary curve. Is that correct, do you think?
I tell my wife all the time, if there's something on sale and it has a good long shelf life, let's buy additional products for inventory, because if prices may go up 10% and you can buy it today and save that 10%, you've earned 10% on your money without having to pay taxes on it. So that's even better for consumers, is to anticipate buying things that may go up in price during the course of the year.
Dr. Sabrin, the Great Resignation, what is it?
Well, this is a head scratcher for me, because I don't know where these people are going when they're resigning their jobs and trying to earn a living. The only thing I can think of is that they're resigning their 9-to-5 job and trying to do their own business online or in their neighborhoods, because there are plenty of opportunities out there to have an online business, which costs very little to start. You don't need much capital to start a business, as opposed to in the old days where you had to have a storefront or go to a flea market or something like that. Now you can do everything online. And if you have a product or a service that's valuable to consumers, which is the key to being a successful entrepreneur, what value are you providing to consumers that they're willing to knock down your door to get the product? And you read stories all the time of young people making 100,000 plus or more on the internet. I mean, people in their 20s or even their teens, because they found a niche in the marketplace, and they're finding out that there are customers for them. In a nation of 330 million people, you don't need a lot of customers to be successful in today's economy.
Yeah, it's crazy. There's one other point I wanted to ask your question, or ask a question to you of. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Neil Kashkari is the president, and he, along with the other folks, cronies with the Fed, say that this is transitory. Now, transitory, they include to mean several years even. And he says that there is a risk if they are saying that the inflation isn't going to be a problem and it turns out to be, and there's a risk if they say it is a problem and they react and it turns out not to be. And he is very much an advocate to say that it's not going to be a long-term problem and the Fed shouldn't overreact. But he says that if they're wrong in that the cost of that policy mistake will, quote, be borne by workers and families, first by them having to pay higher prices and having their real wages eroded, and then by job losses from the recession that could follow. It's a very painful outcome that he wants to avoid. Despite that, he is advocating to put the head in the sand, the Federal Reserve's head in the sand with regard to this, and not anticipate that this inflation is going to be long-term. I think that's a very significant and concerning outcome that he is saying if they're wrong. What are your thoughts on that? Well,
to me, having researched the Fed over several decades and written the book on the Fed and using some of that material for the current book, it seems to me that the Federal Reserve officials, from the top to the staff economists, are intellectually bankrupt. We have a long history of monetary economics and financial instability around the world for the past several hundred years, which demonstrate clearly that if you start printing money, you're going to have bad outcomes, no matter who does it, whether it's the Americans, whether it's the English, whether it's the Chinese, the Japanese, the Russians, et cetera, or the African nations, the South American nations. This all ends in a disaster. And we've seen this with the housing bubble bursting more than a decade ago. We've seen this during the 70s, where we had super inflation twice of double digits and painful recessions to address the distortions created by the cheap money. So once the Fed goes down this road, it's going to end badly. And remember, back in the last super cycle of inflation, interest rates went to 22%. Now, I don't expect it to be that high this right now or the next year or two, but who knows? It may be that people get behavior, as you pointed out before, Rick, start spending money hand over fist in order to get rid of these dollars that are depreciating quickly, and prices just keep on going up and up and up. That's a real possibility in 2022 and 2023. And then the Fed will really have to put their foot on the brake, and interest rates could go really through the roof. So again, it's very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen because we don't know how the Federal Reserve officials react to what the consumers are doing in the economy. So all I know is from my research that inflation will probably be high in 2022 and possibly also in 2023 because there's a lag between the time the money is created until the prices increase. And today we're seeing the prices increase from the money growth that took place in 2020.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very good, Dr.
I can't imagine
Sabrin.
that it would be a good idea. It can't be a good idea for people to just decide to get out of their jobs at this point. That great resignation seems very counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, it is.
Unless they can think they can get a better opportunity working for themselves. And a lot of the young people I taught the last few years, they want to be entrepreneurs. They're not tied to the corporate world. They see, I guess they were youngsters when they saw the great housing bubble burst, and they saw a lot of family members get laid off, a lot of businesses go under. And I think that works in the back of their mind, saying, hey, I want to forge my own way in the economy, not be dependent upon a business for my income.
Yeah, and they may have seen their family members make some really easy bucks by buying the depressed housing and then flipping
houses.
it.
Yep, sure.
Dr. Sabrin, before we have to separate here, I have one other question for you. You wrote a book previously. I think you and Lori talked about medical care, and I see that your book on medical care, your book on the economy have some commonality in that the problems that we currently face inherently come because of the government involvement. Can you tie for us what that previous book?
Yeah, the book is an alternative to Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All. I believe in universal medical care, but it has to be based upon the individual and the family who would be in charge of their medical care decisions, not Dr. Fauci, not the CDC, not President Biden, not a top-down approach. So there is a similarity between medical care and the Federal Reserve. It's a top-down approach. It's a central planning type of approach to the economy. And what I'm suggesting is what works best is doctor-patient relationships, the individual, the consumer, and let people forge their own way in the economy. And let's not try to micromanage the economy, which failed in the Soviet Union. It's failing in Cuba right now. It's failing in North Korea. You cannot have a vibrant, robust economy that's sustainable if we have all these interferences, which cause great distortions of high prices, supply chain disruptions, and all the other things that go with government intervention that economists should know about because we have a long history and we have the economic theory to explain what goes on when the government intervenes massively.
Yeah, two great examples right in front of us, and you've been on top of them with both your books. Can you remind our viewers, what is your book on the medical care? What is that?
It's called Universal Medical Care from Conception to End of Life, the Case for Single-Payer System, the single-payer system being the individual and the family, where they would be control of their medical care decisions, not the insurance companies, not the government. And this is a blueprint for how to get back to real medicine in this country where the doctor-patient relationship is at the forefront of medical decision-making.
And we need that better than ever right now, don't we?
John Lennon's song, Imagine, comes to my mind. Imagine you had medical care that you were in charge of. Imagine if the Fed wasn't ruining the economy. I mean, these are great topics. Dr. Sabrin, It was a real
Thanks
pleasure.
again.
Thank you so much for coming back on with us.